Okay, back again. The two of you guys have been incredibly generous with your time. So really glad we could find a time to chat again here and continue the conversation around education and formation. And really, yeah, it feels like a conversation that's building into just how do we grow and form as human beings, knowing that that's what education truly means, as we've been discussing over these last couple of conversations, and how particularly to pursue that in this place and time that we find ourselves in late stage modernity, um, in what feels like a dark forest where we're not always sure where to turn, we're not always sure where our friends are, and we've lost touch with most of the traditions that led to flourishing in the past. And so, Annie, you've done an amazing job these last couple of conversations of helping elucidate how we can, this anamnesis of this remembering of who we are, what we were made to be, the way in which we were made to live, and then how, as parents and as educators, we can seek to pursue an education for our kids, a growing up for our kids that leads them into that flourishing. So we kind of finished last time. We were going through the sort of curriculum from starting it at age 0, literally in the womb, and we kind of got up to this, maybe middle school age, sort of entering into that teen age, discussing the quadrivium and the trivium, the word and the number, as foundational to that time of education. And we were starting to kind of move into higher levels of education. So, Annie, I'll just go ahead and pass it to you for maybe a little bit of review as to where we were, and then we can continue on with the conversation. But just first of all, thank you both for being here again.
Yeah. Thank you, Gray, for initiating this conversation. It's been really fruitful to me to kind of synthesize, to have the opportunity to reflect on and synthesize, what we've done as a family and share it with others. And always a pleasure to be with both of you. And I love how you frame that this conversation about homeschooling, raising our own children, is really a way of recovering our own humanity and healing our own understanding of family and community life, right? It's not just about getting my kid educated. It's really a way we are given to pursue recovery, right? Together, rebuilding culture together. So quick review, it's rooted, how education has to be rooted in what a child is and what the child's life is for, which I've shared as, a child is an embodied soul made to participate in the triune life of God. And so the purpose of education is to help the child grow up into that participation in the divine life of God. And that begins, as we talked about, the moment a child's born and initiated into a relationship of unconditional love, right? Through the embrace of the mother's womb and arms. Okay. That's the beginning point of welcoming this child into being through love, right? And that's why education is grounded in piety, the orientation of the soul toward God, who is the source of this love, the ground of our being, and the goal of our being, right? That from which we grow and that toward which we grow. And so piety, this orientation and then a posture of humility and worship, right, is the frame in which proper education works. And we talked about how that frame will be embodied for the child through the liturgical life of the family, which, to emphasize, doesn't have to be onerous or complicated. Can we go to church, pray daily, and sing together? Pray every day, go to church, sing together. That will give a robust frame of family piety in which this education can grow. And we talked about the beginning, that this education comes out naturally in just the way we raise a child, teaching them to speak, teaching them to clap their hands, telling them stories, singing them songs. And so education, I think of as taking what is just fundamentally human and natural and then developing to its full potentialities. So beginning with that musical and gymnastic training, the musical rooted in the muses, so that including story and song and dance and poetry, and in story that is literature and history and Bible stories and fairy tales and just deeply rooting our life in sharing stories, as well as dance and song and art and beauty, combined with gymnastics, developing the physical potential of the child. And we talked about how for Plato, this essential foundation in the musical and the gymnastic, right? The musical forms the soul in the harmonious and beautiful pattern of the cosmos, right? Teaches the child the pattern of the cosmos. And the athletic training does that in a way that also builds strength and power and courage and perseverance and self control. And I wanted to share a quote from Plato by way of this review, where he says, a child raised this way in this musical training and gymnastic training will then will learn to love what is beautiful and find offensive the things he ought to find offensive. Fine things will be appreciated and enjoyed by him. Good, beautiful things will be appreciated and enjoyed. And he'll accept them into his mind and soul as nourishment and would therefore become truly good, even when young, however, and still incapable of rationally understanding why. So this is at work. Think of Lewis's essay. I think, Grady, we talk about the meditation of Toolshed, where
Yeah.
he talks about looking along and looking at. We have to prioritize looking along. We have to experience reality before we look at it analytically, lest we have nothing to look at that you're not looking at anything
Mm-hmm.
if you haven't first experienced it, right? So the child has to first experience these realities, look along them before you move to the analytical stage where they could then look at what they've already come to receive as part of themselves and love. And that is what will keep analysis from becoming deadly and deconstructive, right? And destructive. When we tear apart in order to understand something we don't first love, that's when our modern analysis becomes, right, degrading to ourselves and our humanity. So Plato is talking about first experiencing these things, loving these things before they are capable of rationally understanding. And then later, when the rational mind, kind of comes into its fullness and maturity, it would greet like an old friend the good and true and beautiful things when they do arrive. Because anyone with this musical gymnastic upbringing will be in their soul closely affiliated with the true source of reason. Right?
Mm.
Not good. So that's Plato's vision there for that rooting in piety, music, gymnastics. And I wanted to note, this is kind of where we left off last time, that this should include the practical arts. So, and this is something not part of the ancient Greek education as much, because the Greeks were not Christians. They didn't have the full truth. And, Aristotle argued that excellent men would be freed from servile arts, that lower class men are born to be slaves and servant, right? And so the women and the lower class humans would be doing the practical arts, where the excellent men would be freed for contemplation. But as Christianity picked up this tradition, this paideia, this formation, paideia is a word for education as inculturation into a way of life. So as Christians picked up this paideia with a robust theology of the image of God in every man, and good creation theology, right? That Adam and Eve before the fall were made to tend the garden, to practice practical arts for the good of the world and the good of others. And so particularly with the monastic tradition, the Benedictine tradition, and those traditions which bring labor and prayer together, and then the Protestant Reformation with its robust affirmation of the goodness of all forms of work, the Christian development of this classical education should include, I think of it as bringing together the musical and the physical into practical arts that serve others. Baking, woodworking, gardening, knitting, sewing, fishing, hunting, building, all these things that help us fulfill our cultural mandate with beauty and strength, right? So bringing those together in the practical arts, I think is important. Then we said, okay, you have this foundation. Then you move into your formal your formal training, which would begin with the trivium, the quadrivium, in learning the languages, word and number, with which God has written this beautiful cosmos. This cosmos is composed by the logos, the word, and this beautiful mathematical order that undergirds our reality. And so we want to train the child to know those languages well. And so we begin our language arts trainings, grammar, writing, all of that. And we begin our mathematical training. Those formal trainings, we said, I don't know, 7, 8, or whatever feels appropriate to the development of the child. Again, if it's emerging out of the natural education of the child, you're reading to the child will want to learn to read too. And so begin phonics at 4 if your kid's interested, but kind of perceiving the readiness, and not making things too formal, too rigorous, sit down and do this paperwork too much until the child has, you know, already begun to sort of live in the world for a while and is ready with the attention span to sit down and do kind of formal studies. So I think that's where we left it off. Do y'all want to comment at all before I maybe flesh out the rest of the curriculum? Just want to pause for a second. Okay. Jordan says no. And I thought it might be helpful to think about, okay, so here we've kind of built to elementary age. Like, what does that look like? What does this life practically look like, right? And I think what it was really helpful for me to think liturgical, that there are rhythms to our day, anchored in creation. The sun rises, the sun sets. And how to anchor the rhythms of our day within the natural structures of the world, and to create kind of a liturgy, like a rhythmic structure to life that flexes like an accordion, right? I think people who try to schedule, well, at 10:15 we'll do math, and then at 11:30 we'll do, like, drive themselves nuts, drive their kids nuts. And actually, it's an artifact of the machine, isn't it, to have precise clocks rather than a more natural feel to the day. And so what I found most fruitful is that we had a rhythm, and we would let it expand or contract with what was moving through the minds and hearts of our family today. And so that would look like what I call morning time, which oh my goodness, I'm forgetting her name. There's a woman with a book called Morning Time who did a beautiful job fleshing out this way of beginning your homeschool day, which really is like, we wake up, we gather together, and we start together with a prayer and a song, and we read stories, and we kind of just all gather and sit and start our day with this, with rooting ourselves in, maybe we are reciting poetry and it's time to read a story while kids draw or crochet. We read.
Is it Cindy Rollins?
Yes, that's who it is. Cindy
Okay,
Rollins.
I just looked it up. There you go.
Yes. So I love her approach of, like, let's begin with the most important things together: prayer, piety, story, memorizing scripture, memorizing poetry. And then after that, moving to, let's say, 2 hours of formal study. And if you have a family, what I would try and do is, the little kids, we're playing, like, the baby, we're holding the baby, cuddling the baby while we read stories, etc. Then to move to formal time, you kind of try and find something for the littles to do on their own. Like, you bring out the box of Legos or whatever will keep them kind of busy, so that you can then work with, all right, we're going to do our spelling, or we're going to do our phonics, or we're going to do our grammar sentence diagramming, and here's a math sheet. And so trying to spend 2 hours max getting that formal study done, then break for lunch and train. We all do lunch chores together. This is part of those practical skills, and help me make the sandwich or carry the plate to the table. And we break for lunch together, do that together. And then in the afternoon, we would move towards practical arts. Maybe we'd bake something together. Maybe we'd go and garden. Maybe we would, but the afternoon being a more open time where we continue to pursue our gymnastic or practical arts, or maybe practicing piano. And I just found that a really doable schedule, where we start together to get those first important things: prayer, story, scripture. Then, while we still have energy, move to formal study. make sure we are building habits where we share the chores of the house together as appropriate to our age. And in the afternoon, let it be a little more free. If you got an older kid, maybe they go back to their formal studies and you help them as needed. Younger kids, maybe this is where, you're going out to build your tree house with in the backyard or whatever. And then and maybe it moves as they get older to extracurricular curricular. Okay, I'm going to drive you to the sports team as you're developing in higher skill that requires broader community development. That afternoon time becomes the time where we engage the broader community in that way. And then the evening anchor, developing a liturgy of family time. We come back together at the end of the day. Now, this for us would be at different times, and now we come together like 5:30 because nobody's going to 3 hours of gymnastics practice at 4 in the afternoon. But at different seasons, family time wouldn't come together till 7:30, because that's when everyone was home. But having some kind of, we all regularly, most of the time, regroup, eat together, practice dialectic and conversation. There's this great book by Sherry Turkle called about reclaiming conversation. And she argues that conversation is an essential antidote to modernity, which fragments us, but to come together and talk, share stories from the day, play with ideas together, ask questions together, is just an essential part of what it is to be human and to build wholesome, healthy, sustainable relationships. So for us, this like family dinner, so important. And I just love that. Like, my husband was in Scotland this last week. My girls and I, we still gather, we pray before our meal, and we just have conversation. Like, we enjoy thinking about life and laughing about life together and making that anchor. And then, maybe move into, I think of game or story. Like, if you're a game, play a round of cards, or read another story, or watch a show together, have a show you watch together. Again, kind of as you're winding and getting tired, find some way of sharing the joys of life together at the end of the day, and then, heading to bed. So that becomes the liturgy of our day. We wake up with what's most important. We get our formal work done while we still have energy. Then we move into more community, various realms of life, and then we anchor and we end together. And having that rough schedule just creates a rhythm of life that is doable, sustainable, enjoyable, livable, and it's that, yeah. So that's kind of the way that our homeschool day would look. And then on community days, we happen to do that schedule with other people, right? So on co-op days, we drive to co-op, but our co-op largely has the same structure. We start with assembly, where we do our memory work and we pray together and we sing together, right? That you have a morning time as a community. Then we move into our morning classes where we do our formal work. And then in the afternoon, we have our more active based learning. We do science experiments and art projects. And then we head home. So does that make sense? That I found that structure to be, and then once you repeat it enough, your kids internalize it and they don't fight you on it. That's
Mm.
just how life works. And then your habits and your liturgies carry you on those crappy days when everything's falling apart. And if it's your habit and it's sustainable, then you can handle a day that all goes to hell and nothing happens, because that way of life is the norm, and you'll catch back up later. But I really think this is kind of antithetical to our modern life, where the tyranny of the urgent and all the things that everyone else tells us we need to do will crowd out this liturgical life very easily if you don't have firm boundaries. And so for us, we don't leave the house before 2:00. Sorry. Like, any appointments that need to happen have to be in the afternoon or on a Friday. And just, the way, because you think of this as part of that attitude. I had a blog. Did I tell you all the blog? I had Chief Executive Mom. If I'm going to be a mom and a homemaker and a classical educator, I'm going to give it the same excellence I would being CEO of a Fortune 500 company, because what I'm doing is as important, and I'm going to give it that kind of excellence. And you got a CEO of a big company, they have no problem saying, sorry, I don't do things during the workday. That's just how it is, right? And I think that moms and women especially feel so easily imposed upon, and they want to make everybody happy and they accommodate everyone. And that creates a chaos, which makes homeschooling impossible. And so having really good boundaries around that structure, um, and kind of adopting the attitude of this is really important work. And just the way that my husband can't go to the grocery store when he's, at his company. So I don't add things. This is sacred time. Okay, so that's sort of how I structure that day. Again, I want to pause before then talking about like moving to high school. See if you guys have comments, thoughts.
Keep going.
Keep going.
The one thing I think is like a certain inevitability of, like, I mean, kind of Pageau's talked about this a lot, but like the hierarchy of values, Peterson as well. When I reflect on like my time growing up, I went to private school, and then public school, like very traditional. But and so there's an element of that that's like very anchored of like, okay, your day is whatever it is, 8 to 3 is the school day. As I got older, and for me, and increasingly for my mom and I was living alone with my mom when I was a teenager, and tennis was becoming more and more important. Like, I'm hearing what you're saying, and it's essentially what you're saying, like, especially that last part there is like, we structure our days around what is most important. And we really try not to, and that encompasses a bunch of different things. Like, within that whole day you described, it's not one activity, it's a bunch of activities, but it's really structured on what is most important, which is an ordered raising of children, an ordered forming of your day, such that you and your children, your entire family, can be entirely and truly human, and in accordance with, I think you mentioned at one point, reviewing the early childhood of the children being, in accordance with nature that is within them, but there's also the opposite, right? They are part of nature, and so it's like the way you're describing is a day that is in accordance with the fact that we are part of God's creation and His order. And in my experience, it's like this, it is inevitable that your day will be ordered around what is just at the top of your hierarchy and what is most important. And for me, like, that increasingly became tennis when I was a teenager, and you would start to see like, we're making shady deals with our assistant principal so that I can leave school, to drive to practice, and I'm, trying to get certain grades so that that's totally fine, and skipping school for tournaments and things like that, and whatever, missing class. It was like, okay, well, if my grade, I have straight A's, and my SAT score is what it is good enough, like, then that means school is not important. Like, I don't need to be there. If my grades are good without me being there, and my scores are this, then like, why am I, tennis is obviously more important. It's just like really interesting to think back and reflect after hearing you describe that structure of a day, because I'm like, yeah, we weren't just in total chaos. It's just that we were ordering our days off of a different value hierarchy. And I actually do think that it was better that way than ordering it based off the public school hierarchy, because I was wasting a tremendous amount of, like, when I was in class, I even had one of my favorite teachers, probably for this reason, was my AP US history teacher. And the first test I got, like, the first couple of weeks, I was, gosh, it's bad, like, listening to music in class on my headphones, like, really just disrespectful 16-year-old. And the first test I got 103. I got the bonus question right or whatever. And then after that, she said, I don't care. If you want to do whatever you want during class, if you keep getting 100, you keep getting 100 in the test, like, by all means, you don't need to pay attention, you don't need to take notes, whatever. And I was like, oh, great, I can read your review the night before the test and get an A, because it's not that hard, and I'm just wasting my time. And so I think it was better, actually, than me sitting there in a dark room with my headphones, my iPhone, literally wasting time, to be ordering my days around tennis. That was a step up, but it just shows that, like, my value hierarchy had, like, tennis at the very, very highest, to the point where I was not, my mom and I's relationship was, without delving too much into it, like, as unhealthy as it could
Mm,
really possibly be when I was a teenager. There's a lot of reasons for
mm,
that, but not
mhm,
least of which, really looking back, is that I would leave for school at 7:45 in the morning. I would go, and then I would drive from school whenever I was allowed to leave to Raleigh, an hour away, for tennis practice. I would practice for 2.5, 3 hours, and then drive an hour and 15 minutes through rush hour traffic back home, and get home at 8 o'clock, sometimes past 8 o'clock. And then I'd have dinner, homework, yada yada, and then I'm going to sleep, right? And so the ability for my mom and I to have this kind of, like, in a sense unstructured, but just like relaxed time together at the end of the day, where we weren't in a mad dash and I wasn't absolutely exhausted with 10 other things to do, and where she hadn't been alone for hours and hours and hours, just waiting for me to come home, like, that really just put so much stress on our relationship.
mhm,
And it was because of this ordering, this centering around, like, a false value hierarchy.
mhm,
And so it just, yeah, it makes me think of that in my own experience when you describe that day, because it couldn't be more foreign to my experience
mhm,
growing up. And I think most people, even if they don't have something like tennis, maybe it's just the public school schedule, and maybe it's just, rather than one thing like it was for me, it's a crazy amount of different things, right? Like, Jordan picks up his daughter at 2, and for most 7 to 17-year-olds, there's like 3 or 4 different things they're doing between the end of school and dinner time. And, oh, one kid's practice goes through our typical dinner time, he can eat in the car, or we'll eat on the couch because he's not there. And those things just break down to the point where the pattern no longer subsists, even if you
mhm,
establish that when the kids are young. If you allow it to break down because of
mhm,
this ridiculous amount of, like you said, outside pressure, it's just so easy for that to happen. And I think my experience, and that experience I'm describing, is so much more typical, even for, like, 90+% of Christians.
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
you know,
mhm,
so I just wanted to just pause and just
mhm,
kind of name that, because it's like, so what you're describing is beautiful, and it sounds like, and of course I'm imagining an idealistic version of
mhm.
it, but like, the picture I have in my head is beautiful and relaxed and peaceful. I know it wasn't always like that, but compared to what I experienced and I'm describing it, I'm sure it really was.
Mhm. Yeah, I think, yes, it's hard work and there's moments of tension, but there is that deeper piece that comes from living in accordance with your essential nature, right? And I so what you're saying, Gray, I relate to a lot. I mean, that's a lot of how I grew up. And I think that's part of why we're happy to carpet bomb public education, right? Because kids know how much time you're wasting. They know you're wasting a ton of their time, and they know you're teaching in a way that they're going to forget it tomorrow. And that
Mhm.
breeds disrespect in the child for learning.
Everything, actually.
Yeah, for everything, for authority, for learning, for the world. It's all, So I think you're right. So I actually have quite a few homeschoolers in our community who their leading motivation was to make time for sport, right? So they're Christian, but they've got kids who are talented. So I've got a couple professional dancers who've come through our school because with this home based model, I can get most of my rigorous, learn to be focused. I can get most of my rigorous education done in like 4 or 5 hours. And then I can go to ballet practice for 4 hours in the afternoon and then still come home and have time for family. So cutting out the twaddle, the waste that is the public school machine system, you create more space for the pursuit of excellence in specific domains while still balancing life within your family community. So that's one good side. A downside, though, is a lot of those sports are dominated still by the structures and values of the machine, and they will try to control the family. So one of the most annoying things to me is the way that I got a lot of baseball kids, and the baseball tournaments are on Sunday. These kids aren't going to church because they're playing baseball instead. That's a real problem. That's a real problem. So we picked sports that aren't, sorry, church is first. So if this sport requires that, rooted in family and Eucharist, piety first. If this sport truncates our ability to have a Eucharistic community, we're not doing that sport because that's a higher, God is a higher value. There are other things we can figure out to do. So but not a lot of people are able to have the, be that radical, uh, um, are ready to be that radical.
Mm.
But I think the deeper peace and harmony
Mhm.
and like you're saying, the tension it put in your family relationship when tennis became the hierarchy of the family. The whole family can't equally participate in tennis being at the top of the value hierarchy. So it puts tension within the family relationships. Whereas Eucharist community, we all participate equally in that value being, and that brings
Hmm.
harmony and health to our relationships as a whole.
And I think it's important to note, and this is separate. And sorry, but the by no means is it necessary that there has to be a competition between pursuing mastery in any sport and having Eucharistic community and worship be at the top of your value hierarchy. But in the way that the institutions currently exist, it is necessary. It is
Yeah.
necessary, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I think it's really important to note that's not what we're talking about, but the kind of education you're describing, and the days that you're describing, the time that it allows you to for kids and for families to pursue other activities outside of formal academic work actually affords an environment where those institutions don't have to be in competition with Eucharistic community and worship. Like that, that's really, really key point, because I think it's a huge sticking point when you talk about sports, because tennis tournaments are on Sundays too. I mean pretty much every sport realistically these days. And I've thought about it a lot, because it's heartbreaking to think like, man, I don't think I'm going to be able to do the tennis thing with my daughter, despite the fact that at 7 months, she's already like, her favorite toy is her little tennis racket, and she's got great hand-eye coordination. I'm like, oh my gosh. But it breaks my heart, because I'm like, we're not going to go down that road if it means what it meant for me. But it doesn't have to. And that's a big conversation, but I just wanted to point that out.
Okay, I am going to use this interlude to stoke the fire. So first on that last bit, let's just take the image. There's two characters in the movie, Chariots of Fire, provide really nice images here. In some sense, the most obvious one is, of course, the minister, who refuses to run on the Sabbath. So that's pretty straightforward, where you get that very clean image of no, and the story of his struggle with even participating in putting his time and energy on running so that he can run well, and him realizing that he would only choose to do that because God has called him into it.
Mhm.
So that's like that image is very clean. The other image, which I think is actually quite nice and compatible, I don't know if you remember from the movie, but there's also the character who's the sort of the extreme aristocrat. You don't know it until there's like one scene where the camera pulls back from him sitting, and you realize that the entire field of view is actually his garden. And he's the way he practices running the hurdles is he has his butlers and various servants put martini or champagne glasses on them. But if you recall, he's the one who actually gave up his slot so that the minister could run in a different spot, because the missionary wasn't running on Sunday. Why? He's a fucking aristocrat. He has his proper, or he's like, running is not, Olympic running is not at the top of my values hierarchy. It's a really amazing and amusing thing for me to put attention on. Does that make sense? So for him, it was more important to pursue proper nobility, which in this case was in fact to give the right to run to the one to whom it was most properly deserved. And that was his value hierarchy. And so we have two value hierarchies, which are demonstrating how you make choices where the machine, remember the machine is both the political moment of the day and the larger kind of media popular machine that's trying to pressure people into certain decisions. And you saw how individuals were able to rely upon a deeper commitment to make choices that were in fact A, proper, and B, in alignment with their own values. Okay, next image is I'll be self-referential. Hopefully you have this image in your life. If not, we can come with other examples. But I remember when I was a kid, when you would go to a friend's house who had a circular pool, you would discover the fun of getting everybody to begin moving around the edge of the pool in the same direction until you got a real current going. And then you would notice the problem of trying to go the opposite direction. Yeah. Okay. the image here, of course, is the image of what happens when you're endeavoring to struggle with the currents, the many, many reinforcing currents of modernity and the disordered orderliness. So modernity has an order to it. It's a clockwork order, it's a machinic order. Calling it a machine is perfectly appropriate, but it is almost perfectly disordered in its foundation, if that makes any sense. In other words, we're supposed to go left, it takes us right with real current. The reason why I want to bring up that image is that, and you mentioned that in the microcosm, once you've impressed upon your own life enough of the proper order, you sort of proper order, you've just sort of lived it into your life, begin to build a current in the right direction. Then when events occur, the inevitable events occur that take you off, you're able to rest in that liturgy, and it becomes easier and easier to move in the right direction. So that's at the micro level of you and your own family. But this is also happening at the macro level. We're not having this conversation in 1982. I recently was checking out the population of homeschoolers in the US, and it was like 15,000 homeschoolers in the last part of the 1970s. So we're talking kind of 45 years duration. It's like 5 million now. What that's telling us is that those early homeschoolers, they were swimming against the current like crazy. And it was extremely hard for them, up to and including having to dodge the law. In most states in the US, you're not going to get thrown in jail for homeschooling, whereas back in the late 70s, you were going to get thrown in jail for homeschooling. But a growth from 15,000 to 5 million tells me that we are already, the tide has already turned, and the current is already flowing in the right direction at a macro. And we're going to see that as we go to like the next, after Annie does another dose of content, the next context will say, there will be many other families likely in most communities that you can begin to do this with. If there's not already a formal co-op structure, it is quite plausible almost everywhere to do it if you choose to, which is a completely different circumstance than even 10 years ago. So the last piece is to say something like, well, okay, I'll do two. I'll do kind of like a branch. This, to continue to return self-referentially to the core design principles. And he's done it, I think this like 5 times in the last articulation, which is the most fundamental things must be taken most fundamentally, and then work in that way. So you go back to the Eucharist, right? You go back to the basic idea of liturgy. You go back to the most basic things, and then you build up from there. And this is true holographically, meaning the essence of modernity is precisely the disruption of the most fundamental things and the replacement of a simulation of the most fundamental things. And so the only way we can respond to that is by continually returning and remembering, just reinforcing what is the bottom of the values hierarchy, or the top, depending on your way of thinking about verticality. And how do I make sure that I'm sort of allowing those things which are most of the kind of that most fundamental to actually be at the base, not building a tree or a cornerstone, and then work your way up. And so you'll end up with this relationship with sport that says that mastery is something, but winning competition is not of the same sort. Okay, I can begin to sort these things out and begin to put them, use the technique, the meta technique of proper ordering in everything that you do, and you'll begin to notice that there's sort of this beautiful reinforcement effect that works up and down the stack. And then maybe the last piece is the mirror image, or the implication of this movement from 15,000 to 5 million is also that we're in the death rattle of modernity. Modernity is falling apart in every direction, increasingly obviously. So we don't have to carpet bomb public school. Public school is carpet bombing itself in an accelerating fashion. It's hard not to set the notice how perverse and incompetent and evil it is. It requires an active self-delusional will of significance to not witness that. And so the challenge more becomes, how the hell do I escape from it? Not an unconscious acceptance that it's the right thing to do. We're not there anymore. Now it's, all right, how do I get out of this mess? And then to have the metanoia of, oh, I have to actually reorder everything and get things in proper order, and then you start moving with it. But the reason I say that is that we're talking about this in the context of education, but of course this is pervasive across the totality of culture. And this puts a beautiful and relatively salient urgency that everything is falling apart. Education is falling apart, work is falling apart, everything is falling apart. Competition is absurd. Okay? You can see it across the board. And so as you begin to recognize that, there's a larger, say, moving from 15,000 to 5 million in the domain of, oh, we have to actually restore the proper place of the church. We have to restore the proper place of the family. And that's a big movement. That's a massive move in every dimension. And so this is a beautiful, what we're talking about here is so much of the essence. You'll see everything will look like this. Every question that you could encounter, every challenge that you might run into will look like what Andy's doing with education, synergistically, by the way. But we should take encouragement from the fact that we can't really be, how do I say it, unconscious, because our consciousness is provoked continuously by the reality that everything's collapsing around us. And so stepping into that means that you will look to your left and to your right, and you will see other people who have seen it from different perspectives, but they will also say, okay, what do we do? And if we can say, here's a way, here's a path to do the variety of things that we need to do, let's step into it together. You start getting this mesh, and that current starts to grow, and more people moving in the right direction in the swimming pool means that now the current is moving in your favor, no longer against you. End of intermezzo.
No, that's so good, Jordan. That's so helpful to frame it in that big picture. And I think, what you say about the thousands in the 70s, the millions now, the families in the 70s were really breaking ground for us. So modernity is collapsing. The machine is falling apart. These people were out here breaking ground, hard, tough ground. And now we have enough to clear out space to build. Now we have enough people, just enough people, just enough momentum that there's an urgency to be building these alternative structures of community life and culture right now. And I think, the sports analogy you're talking about, Gray, is a helpful way to picture it. As I see, now we have enough people who are homeschooling, people who are recovering a proper value hierarchy to create, you got I-9 basketball, a way for students to play basketball, but it's run by Christians who never have any games on a Sunday. And they make sure that practice is efficient and doesn't burden family life too much. We have a couple dance companies here in Austin who are run by Christians, and they disciple the girls in dance as worship with excellence in skill. That you've got critical mass of enough people participating, in this recovery, in this, that we're able to begin to build institutions that are founded in that proper hierarchy. But it's just beginning, and that's part of why I think these conversations are important, to cast that vision, to encourage people, and to put out the call. Let's gather together and build this stuff, because it's wonderful, and it helps us recover our humanity and our flourishing. And we don't have to just be stuck inside the machine and despair as it falls down. We can gather together.
Let me throw something else out there, man, because you just reminded me. So the image is something like a fractal counterinsurgency against the machine.
Yes.
Because the machine has colonized every aspect of life, we have to then take every aspect of life. So liberating those who wish to pursue tennis from the machine by taking on the piece of, I will produce a liturgical version of tennis, a restoration of tennis to its proper way of getting into life in an orderly way. You're restoring a piece of life. And as more pieces of life are turned from, what would be the right color? Not sure. Oh, from black to light, from darkness to light. It's an image. More the adjacent ones find their life easier. So there's some number of kids whose parents are struggling with the same struggle you're having right now. And if you could say, here's the answer that allows a new puzzle piece to drop in, your kid can now pursue mastery in tennis synergistically with an actual proper relationship with God and with family and community, then their ability to give that now becomes, you're all moving together. And so you start getting these things. So we have to be mindful of the fact the machine has colonized every aspect of life. And every time you interface with the machine, that will be a radical struggle. It would require
Yes.
an insurgency mentality. But as you are able to turn that entire piece of life from dark to light, then everything flips. And that becomes now a piece of the infrastructure of the church, an infrastructure of people living life with proper order.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, great. I'm hearing a calling for your life, right? This is how these things start is you have a gift, you have an expertise in tennis, and you have a child, with maybe an aptitude, and you want for your child a way for them to enjoy this sport, the goodness of mastery in a given domain, the glory of God is the man flourishing in his gifting, but you're unwilling to sacrifice that to the values of the machine. And so you begin to build who wants to play tennis with me and my daughter. And and you start to build in a moment where there's synergy and momentum, one of these alternative institutions so that it's not that, well, I guess I have to give up tennis. Like, consider, is God equipping you in a fortuitous moment to be part of a redemptive rebuilding that's going on? And I know that's how our co-op started, is like, I was like, hell no, I'm not putting my kid in the public school. Come hell or high water. If I have to do this alone, I'll do this alone. But I'm going to start building, and then who around me would like to join in? And then, our school program developed out of that seed of someone, I have educational communicative giftings and a commitment to my own children. And then I start to build here and see who God would bring for that to grow on a
Nice.
community level.
Yeah, in terms of spiritual warfare, we should be mindful of the fact that things like sport and things like art are low-hanging fruit for the adversary to take from us.
Yes.
So those are part of the high ground, the aesthetic, moral high ground. So we should take them back.
Yep. And then they become ministry opportunities. Like I said, I have students at our school who are kind of, I'd say, nominal Christians, but it's their desire to have time for sport that's brought them to my school. And then they're in my classes getting a robust, rigorous, bold discipleship. That the low-hanging fruit is low-hanging fruit for the enemy and for the kingdom.
Nice.
At the same time, is what I'm wanting to say, right? And that will get into your question later, I think, Gray, about the tension between isolation and exposure of our children, right?
Yeah.
I think these extracurriculars create estuary spaces or bridge spaces. And that's an important way of kind of answering that question. So let me finish kind of laying out the curriculum really quick. So
absolutely.
You've got your gymnastics, your musical, that continues. You just continue that in mastery. You add your languages, your math, and your language arts. You add nature study. Okay, so the beginning of science, I think, would be a natural outgrowth of the child's experience of the world. Again, don't start with formal scientific studies in seventh, third, fourth grade. Learn about trees and rocks and flowers and soil and dogs and birds and sun and sky by living amongst those things, right? Living amongst and with those things and learning about them in natural ways, by learning about plants, by gardening. And then the next step, I think, is in nature study is, like, Charlotte Mason has a really good approach here, by drawing. So we're going to practice our drawing skills, our fine motor skills. We're going to go sit in the garden and we're going to go draw plants and then talk about the parts of the plant and then water our plants, and so nature study in this participative way, a natural way, following your curiosity as it's raised. Well, my roses have this yellow, they're yellowing. Why is that? Well, let's go look it up. And, learning through caring attention, natural attention. And then again, I think as we start in, I think, 6th, 7th grade, you could start a formal study of science, which really that moves us to philosophy. That's the next level, because traditionally science is natural philosophy. So philosophy is understanding the essential nature of things so that we can have wisdom, right? And so science was properly a natural philosophy, using logic and reason to understand the nature of things, was rooted in a broader philosophical context. And so as I'm moving into middle school and high school, we're continuing our story. We're just growing in our ability to read literature and history and poetry. It's just continuing that. We're continuing our musical and artistic development. We're continuing gymnastic development, making sure we're using our bodies in ways that cultivate strength and skill. We're continuing our practical knowledge. We're growing as bakers or whatever craft it is that we participate in the home. Growing in our language arts, developing our writing skills, all the way up to college level writing, developing our math skills. We're just continuing all that stuff through middle school and high school, but adding in philosophical study, which we begin with formal science study in middle school, logic, begin with logic. Y'all, this was an epiphany for me. I get to college. I take logic and I was pissed. Like I was ticked. I was like, you mean there's rules to thinking that nobody told me? And I've spent the last 5 years writing essays trying to make arguments without knowing the rules of thinking. Like, what the hell? Like, I was so angry that there's these rules to thinking nobody bothered to teach me. So we don't do that. We teach logic starting in middle school. And then this is where I've developed, the Great Books program, I think is appropriate to a high school core, because you're going to take students through all the great books that have shaped our civilization and our thinking, and they're living books. So I'm growing in our ability to read literature and to know history. But as we go through that progression, we're also tracing the history of ideas. And as we trace the history of ideas, I'm teaching them metaphysics and epistemology and moral philosophy and political philosophy and aesthetics and theology, but in a way that is contextualized within, living history and great stories. And that, I think, should form the core of that high school curriculum. And then you have, when they finish, they don't need to go to college and get $100,000 in debt to get a liberal arts education. They have it. My kids at 11th, 12th grade have read Plato, they've read Aristotle, they've read Dante, they've read Kant, they have that foundation in the history of ideas and the fundamental principles of philosophy already, the fundamentals there, so that then when it's time for the next thing, they're freed from the oppressive financial structures of the machine to just pursue what is needed for their particular calling, right? And I think that's really important. We waste public school, we waste all their time. Like you said, Greg, you're listening to music, you're able to get good grades without even trying. And then we waste all of their time when they're perfect, an average student is perfectly incapable of engaging basic ideas. We waste their time, and then we tell them they need to go, spend tens of thousands of dollars to get the education we robbed them of the last 5 years. It's ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. And so that's kind of the scope and sequence through high school. Teaching philosophy and theology in the context of the historical development, I think really makes it interesting, it makes it alive, and it makes it very memorable because it's rooted in the way that those ideas were embodied in the first place. Okay, so that's kind of the whole scope and sequence. And that, I think, sets up, Gray, maybe some of the other questions you wanted to discuss together.
One thing, that sounds amazing. I would love to be one of your high school students. I'm about 15 years too late, but it reminds me of the experience I had when I started listening to John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. Whereas the first time, obviously the scope of that series is massive. I mean, it's 50 hours or whatever. But it was the first time I had ever been exposed to someone with the ambition and the erudition and the scholarship to be able to pull together seemingly disparate threads of science and history and philosophy, and like weave a coherent narrative. And like the individual episodes that John did are great. The content, the information itself, there's countless insights. But what kept me listening and what was so incredibly meaningful about it was actually the thread. Like seeing, oh my gosh, there is like a historical thread that I can follow that not only is meaningful in itself, but then gives meaning to all of the individual instantiations along that line. And it just was like, I mean, I could have, I did sit there for 50 hours, and I would have gladly sat there physically and gone there, and I would have gladly paid for it. And he gave it away for free, which is just the craziest thing ever. But like what you're describing is just sounds so much like that, where your students are learning. They're reading Plato and they're reading Kant and they're reading a church history and learning about American history and all these things, not in silos, but in this tapestry of threads weaving together so that they understand how things relate, and that relationship is prior to any and more important than any of the individual aspects of it, but it also just gives each individual aspect that much more meaning that you're able to see the ways in which they relate. And like that was just utterly and completely missing from my entire education.
Yeah.
And but it's such a big thing. It seems small, but it's so big if you can relate those things. Like I went to college and I spent 4 more years completely wasting my time. And thank God it was free because I was a great tennis player. But I took AP psychology in high school, and they made me take psychology 201 at Ole Miss and just waste my time. And nowhere in that class did they ever mention, oh, by the way, everything we're talking about is also being talked about in religion and philosophy and science and all these things. It's nope, here's our very narrow silo that will qualify you for psychology 301.
Yeah.
And it just, what you just described is what, well, it's truly beauty. Like it's beauty being seen through all these individual areas. And that just seems wonderful to think of a child, of a person getting to age 17 or 18 and having experienced that, and how properly ready they would be for not only like a calling, like a vocational calling, but that this is the context in which you would feel that 18 or 19-year-old is absolutely ready to start a family. And undergo this journey themselves. Not wait until they're 28 or 29, but at 18 or 19, if my daughter has read Plato and can coherently describe like a Eucharistic theology to me, and also has read, is reading poetry and all these things, and has pursued mastery in one or more domains with the time that she has, of course she's ready to become a mother. Of course.
Yeah. And before Jordan, sorry, delay, before you say something, I have to add on, Gray, to what you're saying, because Charlotte Mason defines education as the science of relations. Okay. As that rising above to see the story of the world and the pattern of the world and the way that all things interrelate in Christ, right? The Logos, the one through whom all things are made, for whom all things are made, in whom all things hold together, that there is a coherent story to the world, a coherent pattern to the world. And when I'm able to see that and see the way that the different domains relate to one another in that coherent picture, that is why it's a liberal education. It liberates me. God, I become a free person because I see the way the world works, and then I can move with wisdom and prudence through the world, knowing the way that it holds together, not having to just do what I'm told, not just having to follow, some kind of dictum, but liberated, free to of my own desire and volition to move in harmony with the way the world is made, because I've been granted a whole picture of the way things are related together.
There's a lot. We put the 3 bullet points. So start at the top. The logoi. When you hit the little tuning hammer against any given logoi, you will of necessity also perceive the logos. And you will notice that they come into harmony with each other in a fashion that is fractally self-unfolding. So any given cluster of logoi, which are of course brought together by the logos, now becomes a logoi that you can hit with that same hammer and perceive the logos. Right? So that structure of the logoi and logos in this fractal relationship is what the word beauty means.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as you say, every experience being able to continuously have that at its center is a properly anamnestic liturgy. Right? It is a proper relationship that remembers Christ in all the ways that word can possibly mean. So then, bullet point 2. It occurred to me that what we're talking about is actually what was desperately being sought by the most devoted theologians in kind of the 1600s to the 1700s, which was they saw the massive wave of the Enlightenment and modernity that was going to be breaking across Christendom. And they were struggling to find a way to preserve or protect Christ, the Logos, the church, against that wave. But they failed. And what they ended up producing something which had drunk fully of the draft of modernity, but endeavored to vomit back out a theological simulation of an alive church. And this has been the thing that has been struggled with for so long. With Pajot, for many of us, has been one of the primary antidotes to say, wait a minute, no, you can go way back to the early church and see what it looked like and notice that there's like this notion about the word symbolic doesn't mean even vaguely merely metaphorical. For example, this is an example of where the error went wrong. But what we're talking about is actually what the actual theological response to modernity is. If you are a pastor or a priest, by the way, we can now reach beyond the Protestant denomination, and you desire to actually restore the church in the face of modernity, you have both the opportunity and the necessity, because again, modernity is fragmented. So all the structures that used to be the church that got colonized by the machine and nonetheless hold life together are falling apart, which will have to now be held by the church again. Mm-hmm. And the theology is this lived theology of actually living in the Logos, to actually express the beauty of Christ in all aspects of life in a fashion that is both held and reinforced, like you say, from and to in everything. And that's the actual theology that is faith, what pistis means, and is the response to and the restoration from modernity. Which implies, by the way, that you could say, for example, the mission field is this. So for great, like the mission field is tennis, the reclamation of all aspects of life for the church, for the Logos. And if we don't do that, by the way, the Church of the West, if we accidentally bring the machine to the mission field out in the world, if you bring the machine to Africa and you're spreading the gospel, but you're actually planting the seeds of the machine, you're doing a terrible, terrible thing.
Yes.
You have to actually plant the true seeds, the good seeds, so that the true gospel will grow. And the only way to do that is to have that living in your life all completely where you are. So we have a massive reconquista that has to occur here. And therefore, all of the resources of the church should be, I would say properly, and must be, I would say more authoritatively, turned in this direction.
Mm-hmm. Yes, which brings up a question that relates really well, Jordan. All that's really well said. A question you had, Gray, about, okay, our school communities, are they mere Christian? Should they be Orthodox? Should they be Catholic? Like, if we're reorienting our proper foundations fractally, right? And a proper foundation is Christ and that Eucharistic community where we share in the bread, the blood and the body of Christ, and that is the wellspring from which our life grows. Then do our educational communities need to have that fractal and foundational integrity organized according to denominational lines or not? What I would say is no, but they do have to be organized according to what Jordan was talking about, worldview lines. Okay. And what I would say is Christians who are ready to embrace a sacramental theology Okay, which is I like how you said, Jordan. Okay, the wave of modernity and the machine is starting to sweep through, and theologians are trying to respond to it, and they responded wrongly, good intentions, wrongly, and I think by modeling themselves after Descartes. So this was Descartes' concern. So when Descartes is writing, you have Newtonian physics starting to make people think that the world functions like a deterministic machine. But if the world's a deterministic machine, then there's no free will and there's no space for morality and spirituality. And so what Descartes tried to do in order to rescue the human person and morality is isolate the human person within the mind. So that's where you get his res extensa and his res cogitans. You got material substance that does kind of work like a machine, but then you have mind substance, which is free, but that creates this dualism where my inner mind is kind of separate and awkwardly, incoherently related to this machine-like world. And so theologians started to say, well, as long as we have, the correct theology or the right ideas, we can preserve the church through modernity. We're giving over our embodied lives to the machine. And that utterly failed. And that's where you get this strange dualism in the church, right? Where as long as the song says Jesus, it's a Christian song, no matter what the embodiment of the tonality and the rhythm are, right? And that's incoherent. It doesn't work. And so what we're having to do right now is the theologians give okay, that answer failed. We have to rethink our answer to modernity. And the answer is the same answer it's always been: incarnational, sacramental. We are integrated beings, body and spirit woven together, and the lives we live in the body form our souls, and our souls are, the life we live in a body is an expression of our souls. They have to go together. And that means we can't just give over our outward physical lives to the structures of the machine, which, Jordan, you said so well, are disordered at the foundation. We can't do that and still preserve truth and spirit and soul and morality. We have to rethink this in an integrated way and rebuild integrated ways of living that are harmonious with the truth of the world. Okay, so that's what we've all been talking about. So, goodness, where did I want to go with that? I can't remember. Oh, you were talking about community structures. And so what I think you have to do is you have to build a school community where people are ready to reject modern dualism and rebuild sacramental theology. And those people don't fall along denominational lines. Okay, you've got dualistic Catholics, got a lot of dualistic Protestants of all different kinds. And so that is, to me, when I'm interviewing people for our community, that's what I'm asking. Do you have a sacramental understanding of the world? Do you want to grow? At least do you see its goodness, and do you want to grow in a sacramental understanding of the world? Then you can partner with us. But if you still have this kind of dualistic frame toward your faith, we're going to be fighting each other all the time as we try to rebuild incarnational liturgies and symbolic perspectives and all of that. So that, to me, so what we have done is create a, and sexuality is often the issue wherein that dualism gets exposed. Are you willing to say homosexuality is a disordered orientation because it splits the body from the nature of sexuality, right? So I'll often find that's a discerning point or a pivot point. So what we've created is a statement of faith that has the Nicene Creed and a statement on sexuality and sacramentology. And so I'll talk through that with potential families and say, do you embrace? Do you want to grow? Is this a way of living in the world that you're interested in? Then our community might be for you. And if not, go in peace. And there's plenty of dualistically structured places for you to enjoy.
It strikes me as it's intimidating how nefarious that dualism is, because even with a statement of faith, a statement of sacramentality, and talking through it, like someone can so easily affirm the words.
Sure.
And it's like talking through a statement of sacramentality is like, okay, you affirm these things, but what does your actual life look like?
Yeah.
Because that tells me, that tells me what your faith is in, right? And so like
Yeah.
that dualism is just so like pervasive and nefarious in that sense. And I just really love to hear you saying all that, because I've had this intuition for a while that the dividing lines, the real dividing line is not denominational. And a lot of people are stuck in thinking that the real dividing line is in, like ontology and worldview. And my question, and this is a tough one. You guys know the meme that is like a bell curve with like sort of the simpleton and then the midwit and then the sage? I think that meme is like one of the best of the last decade. It really helps you think through that. And I think it's really important first to say that there is not like one universal chart like that in each of our lives where we're either the simpleton, the midwit, or the sage. Like generally, actually, we have that in every area. So like some of us are the midwit in many areas. Some of us are the simpleton. Some of us we're the sage somewhere, and we're the midwit somewhere, and then we're the simpleton somewhere. And it feels like as a culture we've all gotten stuck in the midwit, like in the midwit range of just like this analysis, this dualism. And I think I find there's many people that I am around or come into contact with that in many ways have the humility, you might call like the simpleton or like a childlike humility of like there is a genuine openness to being ushered into this, I don't want to say pre-modern, but like this sacramental worldview, right? This like different ontological understanding, even if they have never heard the word ontology ever before, right? But they have that humility, they have that openness, like a true desire to follow Christ, to follow the upward call of the Logos. But they don't have those categories. Like they weren't educated in that way. They're not like maybe the three of us. Like they don't like to read philosophy. They're not listening. Like they have a day job. They're busy. They're maybe more grounded in some ways. But there is that humility, and there is that like childlike, okay, I am open to that. I want to follow Christ. And if my pastor or people in authority were to tell me to do it in this way, and were to really be able to do that in a convincing and holistic and meaningful, actionable way, then they would do that. And I find myself around a lot of Christians that like being generous, I really think are there or not far from being brought there, like could be brought there pretty easily. But it's not obvious to me how to get people from a place of sort of being, I want to say, the term midwit it seems so like negative, but just in that place of they think they have a lot of things mapped, like bringing them to this place of openness, and then having the proper direction to actually get them to commit and usher into like this different way of living. Does that make sense as a question?
Totally.
Like
So just take your midwit graph, take an image of it and flip it. So you've got two now, one mirroring the other. Put the mirror in the middle and call the southern hemisphere the machine, and the true midwit was at the bottom of the machine's curve. The northern hemisphere is sacramental, and the person at the top of that curve is called the salt of the earth. So what happens is when the salt of the earth is captured by the machine, both turned into an agent of the machine and falsely empowered by the machine, but they are most fundamentally captured, that is what the midwit is.
Wow, that's really helpful.
Yeah, that's so good.
So that's our work, is to enable the liberation of the salt of the earth back into the proper relationship of wholesomeness and living. And then everything Andy's talking about, I'll do the positive. Everything Andy's talking about is the sort of thing that the average mom can and should do. So you don't have to be kind of like on the sage side to escape the machine. It's actually simply being properly restored to living an ordinary, wholesome life is what we're actually just talking about. Yes. Of course, 40 years ago, it required a radical individual to even dream of it. Now it becomes increasingly available because the current is beginning to move in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
Can I layer in a piece that occurred to me that's a little orthogonal, but I think it fits in nicely.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So this kind of talks about the horizontal weaving togetherness. Let me see if I can put it. Okay, I'll do it in two steps. The first step is exactly as you said, Greg. There's something that happens for teenagers in this story that I think we should highlight. Because in a profound way, the most important payload, maybe the second, third most important payload of this entire way of educating is ultimately to produce parents who can then do it for their own kids. And obviously that's the 7 to 21-year-old is the person who's receiving that part of the payload. Because as they reach 21, they're entering into the window where they can, and they should, begin becoming first married and then having kids. And then becoming the primary. So you can think about this almost in the way of like how medical training works, where you sort of watch one and then you do one and then you teach one, that kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so there's like a through line of this is the cycle of the repeating of it with really high fidelity.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're in most cases, particularly in the contemporary environment, if you have young children, you probably don't also have older teenagers. You might, but if you've got 7 kids, you might have that. Or if you're like me and you sort of put 2 decades between, you might have that. But otherwise, you probably don't. But other people in your community probably do. And this creates a really beautiful opportunity for a horizontal linkage where the 14-year-old girl, your neighbor's daughter, she can come into a context where your families merge, and she is taking on a certain responsibility of micro parenting or micro educating your younger kids in a period of time, which creates a nurturing reality that is important because there are things that you can't give your kids because their kids need it from a teenager. That's how God designed it. And there are things that the teenager needs to get and give to children, which cannot be done in isolation. So if we basically are, this is, by the way, think about this in terms of the church vis-a-vis tribalism. By virtue of enabling the fact that we are all committed to being part of God's family, our lineage families can horizontally merge in ways that reproduce a full constellation of human relationships and allow all of that to fulfill. Right? And that creates a very strong fabric, right? Because if your teenage daughter is playing a meaningful role in raising my 6-month-old son or my 5-year-old daughter, then we're kind of married in a very powerful way. So there's relational stuff that's being layered in. It's very profound and very meaningful, which is very different than just being associates and very different from just going to church together. And so this also is the fabric out of which the proper church is woven. So I want to layer that. The proper church looks out and says, okay, we've got the whole portfolio of the human constellation. To properly educate anyone requires all of that. And so part of the mandate of what we have to do going forward is find the way to bring everyone into this in the proper order and in the proper way. And then, of course, if you notice that, then the parent, in this case the mom, her work gets lighter and lighter and lighter. So that window where after the, you could say like after the noon break and the kind of liturgy of home exits, now is when actually the neighbor's 16 and 12-year-old daughters come over and they take over some time with the littles while mom is able to give that time. And that's not babysitting, it's actually part of their training because they're going to be moms not too long from now. So, and there's certain things that they happen to be really, really skilled in crafting. And so they mesh, like there's a crafting skill set. Whereas let's say the 17-year-old son happens to be in the calling of the location of sport. So he's going to take a crew of like 7 to 12-year-old boys and do it. But the whole point is, see the synergy there? He's actually getting the experience of being a father, as well as the experience of practicing and honing his mastery, as well as providing a vertical orientation of mentoring those young boys to learn how to move up in their own bases. And that block of time is now being held in a way that is very, very well held. So,
yeah, that's also good.
Yeah, that pairs so well, Annie, with one of the other questions I sent to you, which was, and many would probably feel is provocative, but I think in the context of this conversation, it's not. Especially with what you just said, Jordan, especially laid out so plainly and clearly and based in the family is like, where in this stage does an education diverge for girls and boys, and in what ways, what important ways does it diverge, which is like, that's a that's a scandalous question. It's funny that that's like sort of a scandalous question. It's not to us, but
not to me at all. Since I volunteer at my daughter's school, and there's they have a whole range from kindergarten up to seniors in high school, and it's very homeschoolish in the sense that families are constantly flowing through the space. I have a very, very simple answer, which is, when a 2-year-old or 3-year-old comes into the field, what happens? I can tell you, by the way. Girls from 5th grade up warm the kid, begin the process of picking the kid up and taking the kid around, and the boys don't. I mean, they're not disinterested, and they'll definitely participate, but it's the degree to which that maternal instinct, and even like the posture. It's amazing watching like a 6th grade girl. She'll pick up a 3-month-old, and her hip kind of goes out, and she holds him, and she's just kind of like holding the kid and attending to him while chatting with her friends. It's just like a perfect image of the fact that this thing is really well designed. So yeah, there's a divergence that happens. Those divergences we have the enormous benefit that women's bodies have a built-in liturgical clock that orients all of this quite cleanly in a way that is even we men can tell. So anyway, sorry, that was just a little bit of a joke, but you get it. It's for us, it's not that scandalous, but it's not scandalous at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a tricky conversation, right? Because we could easily fall into an excess. There was an excess where, Dorothy Sayers at one point had to write an essay like, "Are Women Human?" where we emphasize differences so much as to see ourselves as even different species. Women were kept from being given the opportunity to fully develop their own intellectual capacities because, they just need to spend their time on women's work. So I do think there's a danger of overemphasizing gender differences at the expense of our fundamental and shared humanity. And there's a line in Jane Austen's Emma, which I'm about to teach my students next week, very excited, where Mr. Knightley, who is the ideal man, if you haven't read Emma, read Emma and look to Mr. Knightley, gentlemen, as your ideal. He says to Emma, "Whatever you may say, men of sense do not want silly wives," right? That for us to be true helpmeets and partners and with a shared humanity and a shared purpose, we need to have a shared level of formation, right? And so I think it's really important to me that both boys and girls get this foundational liberal arts education. That like we were saying, the way that ability to see the way all things are related together in Christ gives us freedom and wisdom that is necessary to any domain of work, right? Your woman, I think it's wonderful. Like, I encourage my girls to be wives and homemakers and mothers, and that is an important and meaningful vocation. They'll do it better if they have, right, a robust liberal vision of the world. Let's put it that way. And so I do think it's to me important in terms of our shared humanity and our excellence in all domains of human life, and for the enjoyment of relationship together, to fully enjoy our relationship together as men and women, that we have that humane foundation together. Okay. But I do think that there is natural differentiation that we should welcome and nurture, which you're describing, Jordan. And I do think a lot of that comes out in the maybe the musical or the gymnastic. Men and women are going to be drawn toward different embodiments as they pursue formation and excellence in musical and gymnastic domains, right? And so that's one area. And then men, the boys, your boy is drawn towards more aggressive sports. Great. That's a fundamental part of his testosterone driven body. Encourage him to develop virtue and excellence in those domains. Don't force your daughter to play soccer if she really just wants to dance, Let her dance around and enjoy that and pursue, beauty and worshipful beauty through that domain. So I think the first differentiation is within those gymnastic and musical domains. And then I do think in high school, there's a legitimate consideration of differentiation in rigor. Like, depending on the vocational call, I think boys have to be pushed harder, honestly, in high school. Once we get into high school, a lot of the girls naturally like learning, and they're kind of learning these ideas, and that's great. And there's a little bit of a level of, for some girls, exposure to the ideas, but they're not real into it. I'm a little bit of a rare female who wants to smoke cigars and talk phenomenology. And that's okay. So I don't think we have to push women necessarily as hard unless we see a particular intellectual gifting that we want to challenge and call out. But I do think the boys who are going to be generally called to greater positions of leadership in the world have to be pushed harder in their liberal arts tradition or liberal arts education in high school. So I might kind of propose that for discussion as one way of understanding a differentiation in education.
This is reasonable. Let me just kind of highlight a couple of elements of what you said, because I want to make sure they're all collected. I think at the top of the stack, what you had was something like gifting and calling.
Yes.
So
Yes.
one is that we want to be orienting from the point of view of the person, not from the point of view of a sort of a generic individual.
Yes.
So, and this is why this is parenting. This is not horizontal silo that is separate from parenting. This is an extension of the larger scope of parenting in more and more richness. You can think about the same thing as you say. It starts in the womb, and it starts, and it continues and unfolds continuously from that point. So, with my 6-month-old, the challenge is he's not very good at sleeping because he has a very high degree to engage. Okay, fine. The point being that you're dealing with individual persons as persons, and that's the centerpiece. And then we can say that there are strong heuristics, and they get less and less general as you move up the stack in terms of things that are parts of how personhood shows up in general.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, and this is basically to recapitulate the story that Annie told in a very broad brushstroke. So as you're watching, we could even just do it. We could take the gender divide. Let's just take boys. There's a lot of different kinds of boys, right? There's boys who are going to be extremely competitive. There's boys who are going to be competitive fast. There's boys who are going to be competitive slow. There's sort of the more fiery boys, and there's more grinder boys. Both are very competitive, but they have a different way of doing it. There are boys who are going to be very, very competitive in the domain of sensitivity. So they're going to be actually able to sort of sort the nuance, and they might excel in terms of like logic, but not necessarily in terms of rhetoric, for example. Or perhaps they will ultimately get to rhetoric, but they get to rhetoric on the basis of poetry and not on the basis of charm. Think about just the diversity of the particulars of all the individuals that we're dealing with just within that narrow slice. Do that all the way across. And so I think the balance is this balance of unity and multiplicity, the ability to say, okay, we're simultaneously dealing with the true multiplicity that is every distinct person, and able to recognize that there is an absolute unity that is that we are logoing held into the larger logos, and then enter into that balance properly. For the most part, my experience as both a parent and as somebody who's participated in education is that if you've kind of got the proper order well placed, then the kid will tell you what they need.
Yeah. Sorry, Annie, do you have a thought?
No, go ahead, Gray.
Well, I was just going to say, when I sent you that question, one thing that came to mind with reference to that divide between girls and boys, but also generally that we haven't touched on. But Annie, you had that conversation. I think it was pre-Midwestuary. Maybe you guys did like a little bit of an estuary online with Paul and John and them, and you guys brought up which we discussed last time, the pilgrimage versus tourism idea. And so rites of passage, I think you guys discussed that a little bit too, but this idea of a rite of passage. And I think there's been, at least in my circles, there's a Protestant pastor named John Tyson who I've listened to a good bit over the years. And he developed this thing called the primal path, for his son that he has since kind of commercialized and spread with other people. And you can kind of, there's a book and stuff. But it is sort of like a male coded great books pathway from age 13 to 18, but also with like, that a father is supposed to walk through with his son, like in the mornings, reading together. And then every so often along the way, I think you're supposed to start at 12 maybe. And it's at like, you have this initiation sort of ritual at 12 that marks the beginning of the primal path. And it's the father and the son and other men, a group of, I think, 4 to 8 other men that are in your close community or very good friends of the father, family friends, maybe uncles, that you have this initiation sort of ceremony to mark the beginning of the primal path, where both the father, but then the other men sort of go around, like, I think he did it with his son around a fire. They're going around the fire and saying, like, this is what I see in you, to the boy. This is what I see in you, maybe even speaking prophetically over, this is who I see you becoming, in sort of general terms. And then each year, or it's 2 years along that line, there are sort of these sort of rites of passage or seminal moments that, he gives suggestions and various things, ways you can do that ultimately culminate in like, I think at 18, at the very end, he suggests, like, you need to have a true, like, rite of passage. Big thing for his son, it was walking the Camino Santiago. So he there was a section of it that I believe his son did alone, and his dad was there, whatever, and then his dad joined him for the last X number of miles or whatever it was, and that was like his kind of rigorous, like, welcome to manhood sort of thing. And I wonder what you guys think about what kind of place or role that takes in this educational process, as like within this category of pilgrimage that's apart from just the day to day. And then, maybe what that might look like also for girls. I mean, obviously becoming a mother and getting married and becoming a mother, those are like, huge sort of rites of passage, you would think, but especially in a world where those are happening a little bit later, it's like, what does that look like for a girl to be initiated into womanhood, in a similar way, but just also generally, like, I don't know. Curious if you guys have thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
Well, I've long believed that this notion of rite of passage, and specifically a culturally produced one for males, is strictly necessary. So I could go into that, but I sort of assert, yes, that is the case. There needs to be a process, and that process needs to have a bunch of characteristics to it, not the least of which is stake. It actually should be meaningfully hard, but also love. It can't be torture. It actually has to be something where there's a meaningful hardness that grounds you in saying, and I am also fully held in love by my father, by my family, and by my community. The key signal is, I am me. I'm now afforded the responsibility and the opportunity to stand before the world on behalf of what I care about as me. And also, I am completely held by those who are also part of the story with me. Both those tones have to be part of that process, but that's sort of built in. It has to happen. As you say, there's boys don't have that built-in threshold, and the threshold, having witnessed childbirth several times, I can tell you that if the male rite of passage doesn't have that level of intensity, then you're not producing something that is necessary on the other side.
That's good. I did not grow up with brothers, do not have sons, didn't really have very proactive present fathers. So, in terms of the maturation of young men, it's foreign territory for me. I largely deal with young men within my classes, right? Which is why I'm thinking in terms of this intellectual formation. My answer was kind of what I've found is, in our particular cultural context, I have to push the young men harder. Partly because I think there's a general malaise and apathy among young men that we're talking about, right? The crisis of young men, and that they need the voice of challenge, which I find difficult as a female teacher to give them, which is why I brought a dressage whip to class one day. because I have to make myself big. I have to bring some power and gravitas and force to garner their attention in a way that I don't want to. Women, I think, when they will tend toward whining and manipulating when they feel that the boys are not giving them respect or attention, and that doesn't
Mhm.
work. That just breeds greater disrespect. Um, so I find that I have to kind of grow myself to fulfill a missing male role, unfortunately. And sometimes I do that by bringing a whip or a sword. Just for like theatrics, getting attention and that kind of way. But I've started to beg different dads in the community, will you come teach 1 week of classes for me? They need men to model male interest and in what we're doing. So a little bit to add from the female perspective, I do think in some ways, because women's bodies in some way initiate us in rather potent ways to femininity, right? That let me gather my thoughts here. So part of this question is also pushing uh the tearing apart of discipleship and education, right? We see that how much modernity has made education a content driven thing, or a preparing you for college or a job. And we've lost sight of its broader context in discipleship, the formation of the soul, the formation of the person within a coherent community. And so we're really having to think through, how on earth could we rebuild more coherent structures of discipleship, of raising up our men and women to be part members as men and women in a broader community. Well, we don't have coherent broader communities. I mean, it's just kind of a mess, right? So, Gray, I like the idea that you're proposing. Jordan, what you're saying has a lot of wisdom. One thing we've found in our community, again, coming from growing up among sisters and having only girls, that the recovery of formal dancing and social dancing within the community has seemed to have a really positive effect of helping our boys and girls grow into young men and women. And so we've just been fortunate, some families who had vision for creating, the Austin Christian Austin homeschooler formal dance or something. And it's just this tradition of, there's a big formal dance every spring that everybody really loves and they want to go to. We rent a ballroom at UT. It's a whole formal dinner with like all the forks and spoons. And so they review their manners. They get some basic training in,
Yes.
the boys have to stand up when a girl comes to sit down, and they pull out the chair. And so there's training in those manners. And then they have to do 6 weeks of ballroom dancing classes in order to attend. And they're really strict about that. And so the boys and girls are learning how to relate to one another in a way that is gendered and social and fun. And I found that the girls all have to wear dresses and be feminine. And so that this kind of formal event they get to go to, it serves as a kind of communal initiation. The younger kids are really excited. It's hard to get a spot into the formal. And so your first year going to formal is very exciting. You pick your dress and you go to your dance classes. And that communal ritual and activity in some ways helps, is a positive way to form them in growing up as men and women who relate to one another as men and women. So just propose that as an idea. And then, what I found, that my kids, then they get good at social dancing and they like it. And it's a healthy space where they can be flirty without crossing too many boundaries. And so all my girls have continued social dancing. They they go on a regular basis to places that have line dancing now, or square dancing, or there's a swing dancing syndicate downtown. And so they've continued that as one of their primary ways of relating to one another, having male and female friendships.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I was always intimidated by people that were taught how to dance growing up, because I was offered no such thing.
Yeah.
So
It's awkward and scary. I mean, I grew up hating, dreading going to our prom, right? Because I don't know how to dance. Nobody taught me how to dance. And so actually training them in skill gives confidence, right? Confidence and security in their ability to relate well to one another in the world. And they're just skills we have to take the time to teach rather than just, this kind of idolization of freedom and individual expressivism. Well, do whatever you want and just you be you. Actually throws kids out in a world with a lack of skill and confidence and creates really dysfunctional coping mechanisms.
Yeah. It's funny. I'm remembering that growing up, so up to about sixth grade, we had the folk dancing as part of the fabric of our world. So we would do something like variations on square dancing as the way that we would dance together socially. And then at seventh grade, that just disappeared entirely, and it became just ordinary, modern kind of like what's that guy's name? John Huston film uh, dancing, and everybody just turned off. Like it just completely changed the entire texture of what was
Mm.
happening all at once. Like it just went from like fun and alive to very challenging and kind of not dark, but dreary, I'd say.
Yeah.
Something else. Hold on. Something else I was thinking there. It was. Yeah, maybe what I'll do is I'll kind of emphasize the negative side of the necessity of, in this case in particular, men teaching or providing teaching opportunities for boys, which is that um, there's a lot of bad behaviors that boys can ultimately produce, or forms of deformations of character that won't necessarily be legible or properly legible to girls and women because they were ultimately at the end of the day for the purpose of manipulating girls and women. And this can show up even at a very young age. Of course, in these days, it's not that uncommon. You encounter a 20-year-old man as a man, and you're like, yeah, that guy's a complete asshole. But he's doing a great job impressing the women around him because he's figured out how to kind of hack things that are gaps. But if you put him in a group of 20 men, his shit will get straightened out, right? Because they're not going to allow that inside the tribe. That's the key thing. If you have a boundary, there's an interior, and there are men who are policing the interior of the tribe and create the boundary of the exterior of the tribe. That kind of maladaptive behavior is highly legible to other men. And by the way, it maps very much to this idea of shy, sharp behavior in dogs, like a poorly trained dog. You're like, imagine a dog with like their tail ducked between their legs and head's kind of down, and they kind of like growl when you come near them. It's called they're shy and sharp at the same time. It's
Mm.
just a poorly socialized dog. And so poorly socialized boys who are not getting the right early honing, like the iron sharpens the iron thing. They end up building all kinds of weird character defects that can't really be identified or honed out by a female environment, but are naturally honed out by a male environment because they show up as a profound lack of character, which you can't trust. Like think about it in terms of like you're going out on a hunting uh, party, and failure would lead to people being harmed or killed. And you notice one of these failures of character in one of the other young boys, that's just not going to fly. It's a very high on the value stack, and the process for honing it out is relatively conservative, pretty deep in terms of how people behave. And so the point is, it's beautiful because if it's caught early and caught in a context where everybody's actually orienting towards good parenting, then that can be
Mm.
turned and honed properly. And so this again goes to that notion of just if we've got the full constellation and people are held with the right set of relationships, everything gets a lot easier. Like you don't have to come in full body armor, plate armor with a sword so that people think maybe you might be a medieval knight. If you actually have just a handful of men who are part of the teaching, it makes things much easier for everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead,
Which,
Anna.
by the way, is one of the main themes in Jane Austen's novels. So I'm just a fan of Jane Austen and her ability to help heal heal the soul. So that's one of the key themes in both Pride and Prejudice and Emma. And I don't want to give away the plot, but the male who fools the females, but not the male characters, is
Yeah,
like
there you go.
central to the plots there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It reminds me, just with reference to like the full constellation and what you're saying, like that the male presence curbing those behaviors. Like in my context of tennis, when I was a teenager, and I was the oldest and the best player at the academy that I was at, and you'd get younger, talented players, 2, 3 years younger than me, boys specifically. Girls, again, rarely. It's just different, but especially with boys. Um, and they would exhibit just all of the class, like lazy and, bitching and moaning and trying to get away with things when the coaches weren't looking, and various things like that. And uh, my coach could say a million things, and it like maybe have a tiny effect or whatever. But when I would, like, I can, I may have like scarred a couple different kids, but like what when I, as the 19-year-old or whatever, the oldest and the best player, like, would be hitting with a kid, and for him it felt like an honor to hit with me. He's 15 or 16, and I would, like, very sharply be like, you're not paying attention, you're not focusing, you're not moving your feet, and you're complaining. If you do it one more time, you're off my court. We will never practice together again. And because I can't get better if you're doing that, and I'm going to get better. And one time, you say that one time, never a problem again. Never a
Yep.
problem again.
Proper ordered properly. Like, as you say, even as you're saying it, I can feel the energy of being a young boy. My shit's like, I'm standing up straight immediately, because like, where it's supposed to sit.
Yeah. And now being on the side of the coach, like, I'm like, man, I can hearken to that, and I can do a good job of, like, trying to enforce those boundaries, but my role is different now. So I can't have that effect on the high school kids that I'm coaching now in the same way that I could when I was like an older version of one of them. Like, that was the proper role. And so, like, it's hard for me because I have like a 16-year-old I'm working with right now who's great, but he needs 19-year-old me, not 29-year-old me, and 19-year-old me is not around. And so it's just that full constellation. And it's really hard. Like, his dad, he just started training with me recently, and his dad has been he's been overjoyed. Like, he was at an academy where he was barely coached, given no attention. He just, like, when he came to me, he was like that dog, like, tail tucked between his legs. I was like, man, this kid hates tennis. Like, why are you even out here? Like, you're not having fun. You don't want to be here. And your attitude sucks, And that first day, I spoke truth to him, like, very strongly, like, hey, you really doesn't seem like you want to be here. Like, what are you doing here? But you're a very good player, but I'm pretty confused. And here's all the things you're really not doing that you should be doing, but also, like, you have a ton of potential. I just spoke truth to him. And he, like, within 3 weeks quit the academy and came to train with me, and his dad is just, like, overjoyed and everything. And I'm like, hey, I'm really happy to be playing this proper role of a coach. I'm sad that you've never actually run into a real coach before. But also, I don't want you to think that I can provide everything, like, they're it absolutely key to your son becoming who he needs to become are peers at his level, and peers above his level, and peers below his level, like you said, that he can actually take a proper role in, because it helped develop me when I had to help develop 12-year-olds. So just, it rings so true to me, that constellation. And unfortunately, it's really difficult to find that. Well, man, I feel like we only have a couple more minutes. I wonder, and this feel free to just say this is food for thought for maybe another conversation. But I wonder, the last thing I'd be curious to hear would be, like, last time, Jordan, you mentioned, okay, the key would seem to be education of parents, right? And the church playing its proper role in actively educating parents. And I just wonder if you guys have had any more thoughts about, like, what does that look like? And how do we make that happen? Is that just on a church by church basis? Like, Jordan, you having these conversations with us and then saying, like, I know you're tight with your pastor and you've been trying to influence, helping influence the direction of your church. Maybe it's just on that level where you're going back and you have this relationship with your pastor. And you're saying, hey, we've got to educate the parents in our community. And the same for Annie, and to the degree that I can, as a young man who, doesn't really know my pastor, making inroads to try to do that. But there's also the possibility that there's something like at an institutional level or at a different level. So I'm just curious if you guys have any thoughts, and they could be sort of parting thoughts here. And maybe we just need to have another conversation about it, more geared towards that, now that Annie has done such a great job of sort of laying out the curricular aspect.
Well, the thing that occurs to me, Gray, is that almost all things have a triadic structure to them. And the one that came to me as you were speaking was content, institution, and relationality. And so a lot of content has just been provided in the last 6 hours we've been speaking, and could be reified and then expanded upon. And I don't know if you noticed, but there's maybe like 3 layers abstract. I think there were 3 layers of abstraction. Design principles of how to do this in general, very concrete examples of what it looks like, and kind of like the curriculum in the middle. So that's content, and that content, the beautiful thing about it is that it's very, 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 very difficult to produce content at high levels of quality, but it's actually really easy to read it or watch it. And so it can be the kind of thing that has a field effect, right? It can percolate out, it can be disseminated. Then there's relationality. So this is the actual engagement at the church level, at your community level, your family. Your family, a mom watching this says, I'm stepping into it. And Anne will begin the job of saying, hey, how can I maybe enroll or enlist other people in my environment? Obviously, you're going to probably need to enroll your family. But maybe you can get several other families, maybe you can actually get the larger church, like something like that. But that's the level of relationality, actually human. And then there's institutional. There are people, I can do a kind of an intermediate. There are people at your church who are administrators. They have something like logistics as a gifting, which my wife does not have logistics as a gifting. So if there was somebody at your church who would identify this as a mission field, say, hey, let's organize, in just the same way that we use your administrative gifts to organize people going to do wells or build houses, we actually use this administrative capacities to build. The mission is to support the education of our own church, and you have a gifting to support that operational and logistically. Do that to make it easier for the moms and for the families, for example. And of course, that can go up levels higher and say, hey, there are people who are gifted in turning what we've been talking about into a more robust, more shareable, more comprehensive piece of content. Awesome, do that. Or creating a formal program that actually specifically focusing on some parents who want to say, hey, what would it look like for me to do like 6 weeks of time, or maybe 3 hours a week, 6 weeks of learning this in more detail, or building a mentoring program and saying, hey, people who have been through this sort of thing before, you sign up to be available to actually be not on call, but to be on call to have a dialogue. And so a mom has a particular problem, Annie's sort of one-on-one right now, but imagine if it were possible to kind of like secure some of Annie's time and say, hey, I've got this question, could I get 30 minutes or an hour of your time just available for that? That'd be an institutional structure. So I think all 3 domains are always necessary, and I think all 3 domains, the kinds of things, this is so nascent, you can imagine expanding it. Just one thing and there's the anointing of all that currently exists. So there's, of course, homeschool co-ops, there's homeschool programs. I was gifted to be connected with this homeschool program coming out of those folks from Montana. And Brandon, we met them. Actually, I think they drove us to actually, it's their house that we actually had a cigar and overnight. That went through and built their own program. I think it's called Heart or something. So there's a resonant frequency where that is an infrastructure that has certain things that they've already begun to build. And it's like, great, why don't you just do more? How can we help you accelerate or harmonize that? Because if everything is oriented towards that center line, if everything is in that Eucharistic sensibility, if everything is saying, hey, at the end of the day, we're all coming from and pointing towards Christ, then it really becomes a question of what is your particular calling, what is your particular gifting, and how can I give to you what is in fact properly yours, take from you what is not properly yours, and allow the anointing to sort of percolate all the way down the step.
Yeah, I think Jordan lays out a good roadmap. I'm going to name some of the obstacles that will arise on that roadmap. Lewis says that courage is the main virtue necessary to unlock all the other virtues, right? Because if you don't have courage, then when your other virtues are challenged, you'll cave. So I think that a main challenge in developing the models we've been talking about is courage. It's going to take courage of leadership, because what I see is the church is in many ways insecure and anxious right now. We got to keep numbers up so finances are up so that we can pay our bills and our salary and, these practical, we got to have we can't lose people. The church is anxious about losing people. And so if the church, okay, what will keep pastors and leaders within the church from having the courage and the vision to build communities like this is the fear of people who don't get it yet feeling judged and leaving. Right. So if we really have the courage and conviction to promote this homeschool model, we're going to make our public school families feel bad, feel like second class citizens. And we don't want to do that. We want them to feel welcome and so that they will, get the gospel here. And so that's what I found is the main problem, at least in my area, is churches don't want to take a stand on the education issue because that might make people feel bad and leave. And so I think that to build these kind of models will take clarity of vision, the kind of vision we've been trying to communicate and talk about, that the machine is collapsing, and it is for people's good that we speak with clear conviction to invite them into a renewed way of living and raising and discipling their kids. And it doesn't have to be communicated in a form of judgment, but of invitation into a better way, to have the clarity and the conviction to take that stand, so that then we feel confident in allocating resources and communicating that vision to our broader community. So I think to me, that's the primary challenge, is leaders who are willing to have the courage and the vision of conviction, particularly when this kind of conservative homeschooling gets politically coded in maybe politically contentious communities. Again, I live in Austin, in Texas, so I'm in a very blue city and a very red state. And so these kinds of political anxieties are very strong within the church, and it prevents people from having the vision they need to actually build anything.
Yeah.
Nice.
So that's a challenge to encounter. We'll encounter.
Makes a ton of sense. It strikes me that something like what you're both describing, Jordan, like call it a 6-week kind of class course, whatever, this kind of sort of institution building within the church and effort would serve as a really strong litmus test for not only where people sort of fall, but even very, very specifically, like you go through everything that we've talked about over the last 6 hours, you're gonna find where people who are part of your community, like you're gonna find points of disagreement that didn't come up by just church attendance on a Sunday or serving together on a Tuesday or Wednesday night. You're gonna find even you as a church leader, you're gonna find places like, oh wow, we have not been talking about this enough, or stressing this enough, or educating this way. And so I think it could serve as a really useful test. Like you said, Annie, like it's going to there is division that will happen, but the word is sharper than any two-edged sword,
Mm-hmm.
so there's, you can't avoid that. Well, I think that's a great place to stop. So I really appreciate you guys. Feels like we, as much as you possibly could in 6 hours or so. There's probably an endless amount you could say about any one aspect of any of this. But Annie, thank you so much you really took us to class. I mean, seriously, I really, really appreciate it. I've listened to each of the conversations a couple of times, and every time I'm like, oh man, I forgot that thought and that aspect. And I've just learned so much from you and Jordan, always your thoughts and your interaction. That's the biggest reason why I wanted to get the two of you together, is because when Jordan mentioned education, I'm like, oh man, I think that the interplay between both of your ways of thinking would be marvelous. And I truly, it has been. So thanks for letting me, be part of this conversation, and both of you guys being so generous with your time. And I'm sure we'll all be talking again in the future. So Thanks, guys.
Beautiful.
Thanks, Gray. It's been a joy and an honor to get to talk about all this with both of you.
Yeah. All right.
Right.